We're just the man we needed, and we were determined to get you here.
Two police had a snack at the cafe, after which Officer Edward Malus went on patrol. It was routine work for him. Suddenly Edward noticed that a toy had fallen out of a car window. He turned on the siren to get the driver to stop. Edward returned the toy to a girl. Suddenly in front of the officer a truck drove into the car. A fire broke out. Edward tried to save the passengers, but didn't have time because there was an explosion. Some time has passed. Edward is trying to overcome his depression. One day a colleague visits him and asks how he is doing. Edward is thinking of resigning. The colleague hands him letters. Out of politeness, Edward offers her a seat. She tells him that no bodies were found in the car. The driver and her daughter seem to have disappeared into thin air. In addition, the car was not registered. Left alone, Edward reads a letter from his ex-girlfriend, whom he hasn't spoken to in years. Willow disappeared from his life, but now she is asking for help. The woman confessed that she had a daughter named Rowan who disappeared 2 weeks ago. The letter includes a photo of a girl who looks very similar to the one Edward saw in that car. Willow now lives on a small island called Summersile, where she grew up. Since she doesn't know who to turn to, she has reached out to her ex-boyfriend for help. After finding information about the island on the internet, Edward went to work the next day and showed the letter to his colleague, Officer Pete. Edward also told him that he had been engaged to Willow, but she suddenly broke up with him. Despite old grievances, Edward intends to go to the island and find Rowan. Pete thinks this is madness. Edward learns that there is a closed community living on Summersile, where there isn't even telephone communication. Soon he sets out on his journey. He thought he saw the girl on board the ship, and these visions continue to haunt him, so he takes sedatives. Telephone communication is lost, the ship stops at the pier. Edward manages to persuade the pilot, who almost daily delivers orders to Summersile, to take him there. The pilot explains that it's a private island where people live in a very tight-knit, closed community. They don't like outsiders. To avoid trouble, the pilot drops Edward off far away from the village. Soon he meets some women who ask him by what authority he landed on private property without permission. Edward explained that one of the island residents had sent him a letter about her missing daughter. At that time, 2 male workers were silently doing heavy physical labor. The women advised Edward to go to Sister Summersile, who is the leader here. Edward showed the women a photo of Rowan. Without even looking at it, they replied that they did not know the girl. But according to them, Sister Willow does indeed live on the island, although she has no children. They advised Edward to speak with Sister Summersile, who is the leader on the island. Edward arrived at the meeting house where there were only women. He asked Sister Beach if there were any available rooms for him to stay in. Suddenly, Willow walked in. Edward could not believe he was seeing her after so many years. Sister Beach offered the officer a drink of honey, the main gift of their island. Edward announced to everyone present that he intends to speak with each of them because it is an official police investigation. Sister Beach found it strange. This is Washington State, and Edward is a police officer from California. But Edward didn't care about these formalities. Handing the ex-boyfriend a note, Willow silently left. She wrote that she was constantly being followed, so they needed to meet in a secluded place near the pier and talk. Willow also advised Edward not to trust anyone or anything. An hour later, Edward was at the appointed place. Despite everything, Willow still wears the engagement ring once given to her by Edward. The woman told him that everyone on this island denies that she has a daughter. Edward wondered why his bride ran away from him many years ago. Willow admitted that she was not ready for changes, so she decided to go home. Now the most important thing for her is to find Rowan. According to the woman, Edward is the only one she trusts. That is why she turned to him for help. Willow warned her ex-beloved that everyone would try to mislead him, so he needed to be extremely careful. When the bell rang, Willow hastily left. In the evening, Edward overheard the women talking about the need to prepare for the day of the Wicker Man's return. Edward also noticed that several cassettes were missing from his bag. At night, nightmares continued to haunt him. Waking up, Edward heard strange sounds and saw Rowan running away from the window. The officer immediately followed her. This led him to the barn. Edward called the girl by name, but she continued to run away from him. Climbing to the second floor, Edward noticed a red fabric. Suddenly he fell through the flimsy wooden floor and almost fell down. The next morning, an officer asked why the honey was store-bought. Sister Honey replied that they didn't have their own honey because the year had been a bad harvest. Edward, puzzled, noticed many black and white photos on the wall from the harvest festival. However, last year's photo was missing. This seemed suspicious to him. Edward found Sister Honey again and showed her Rowan's photo. She replied that she didn't know this girl. At that, Honey acted very strangely.
When you leave, will you take me with you?
In the woods, Edward saw several pregnant women carrying harvest. He didn't understand how this could be possible since there were almost no men on the island. Edward visited the local school, where only girls study. When the teacher asked them what a man represents in essence,
phallic symbol.
Seeing the stranger, Sister Rose was very unhappy. Edward showed his police ID, explaining why he was there. However, the teacher and all the girls persistently denied Rowan's existence. Seeing an empty desk, Edward realized he was being misled. Despite Sister Rose's protests, Edward took the attendance journal and found Rowan's name crossed out. Instructing the students to write an essay, Rose suggested continuing the conversation outside. The woman said there had recently been an accident, a fire. Rowan is no longer alive, and her grieving mother cannot come to terms with her loss, continuing to believe that the daughter is somewhere nearby. As Edward left, he saw a woman among the workers who was an exact copy of the teacher. But she said her name wasn't Sister Rose. Edward realized that madness was happening on this island. At the cemetery, he found a fresh grave. But Willow said that Rowan wasn't there. Everyone else just wants to make Edward believe the opposite. According to Willow, all the female residents of the community hate Rowan, blaming her for the bad harvest. Also, Willow admitted that Rowan was Edward's daughter. He was shocked and couldn't understand why his beloved didn't tell him about it earlier. Willow led Edward to Rowan's room, where she had last seen her daughter. Willow was gone for only half an hour that day, and during that time Rowan, as well as all her things and toys, had disappeared. The officer became suspicious because the woman's story had many inconsistencies. Seeing the plane, Edward rushed to it to use the radio, but the pilot was nowhere to be found. Edward waited for him for a long time when he suddenly noticed someone's hair under the bridge. Edward immediately dived into the water and saw Rowan, but it turned out to be just a terrible dream. Because of the heat, Edward didn't feel well. Tired of waiting, Edward decided to swim to the plane, but the radio wasn't working. Then he went to the house of Dr. Moss, who besides medicine, was also engaged in photography. There were books on ancient rituals on the table. The officer asked the woman to make a copy of last year's photo. She promised to help. Hiding near the house, Edward saw two women in beekeeper masks come to Dr. Moss. They all went somewhere together, and Edward took advantage of the moment to break into the house. He read about the fertility festival. According to ancient custom, the elder of the tribe must offer a sacrifice. This guarantees a rich harvest in the future year. In the locker, Edward saw a photo of Rowan, who as it turned out was chosen as the symbol of fertility last year. It was the worst harvest in history. Edward demanded explanations from Willow. He couldn't understand why she concealed the fact that their daughter participated in the ritual. Willow said she didn't attach any importance to it because it was just harmless traditions. The lovers kissed, as they did many years ago. In the forest, Edward saw men preparing firewood. Edward offered his help, but the man looked scared and silent like a disenfranchised creature. In a state of panic, Edward ran through the apiary. He was surrounded and stung by bees. Eventually, seeing Rowan in front of him, the man passed out. When he woke up, Dr. Moss was sitting next to him. She was served by a man. It turned out to be the home of Sister Summersile, the leader of the community. After making sure the gun was in place, Edward finally met with Sister Summersile in person and asked her permission for exhumation. He was sure that there were answers in that very grave. The woman said that their beliefs did not concern other people. This island is ruled by the Great Mother Goddess, and Summersile is her earthly vicar, the spiritual origin of this colony. Inviting Edward for a walk, Sister Summersile told him that her ancestors had long fought against the oppression of women and settled on this island in the mid-19th century, where they founded their own cult. Men were only needed here for hard physical work and reproduction. Edward was tired of playing these games. He was determined to carry out the exhumation. To avoid unwanted attention, the officer did it at night. In the coffin, Edward found a homemade burned doll, much to his horror. At that moment, sobbing was heard nearby. Believing it was his daughter, Edward began searching for her in the partially destroyed building where the temple used to be. Edward went down and found a hatch. In the water floated a red sweater. Edward opened the hatch and dived into the water. He swam for a long time with a flashlight until someone suddenly closed the manhole cover. Unable to get out on his own, Edward called for help, but no one answered. The man sat in the water all night, replaying the mysterious accident on the road in his head. The next morning, Willow freed her beloved. He showed her Rowan's sweater and the doll, demanding to know why it was burned. Willow had no answer to this question. Edward felt that something terrible was about to happen and ordered Willow to lock herself in the house. Edward returned to Sister Summersile's house, but she was nowhere to be found. In one of the rooms, the officer saw a man covered in bee stings, and in another room, a woman surrounded by insects. Edward was horrified by what he saw. The officer didn't know that Sister Summersile had been in her room all that time. Outside, Edward saw Sister Rose in a creepy mask. The teacher said that they were all preparing for the ritual. Pointing the gun at Rose, Edward took her bike. On the way he met two elderly twins who called him a drone. In a panic, Edward ran to the meeting house and asked men there for help, but they were afraid to even speak. Edward looked into every house hoping to find Rowan. Everything that was happening in this village seemed like extravaganza of absurd. Rushing to the pier, Edward saw that the plane had sunk. The pilot with no signs of life was lying on the shore. Girls in masks were watching all of this. Edward had no choice but to return to the meeting house. He knocked out Sister Beach. Meanwhile, the women were gathering for the ritual, praising the Mother Goddess and praying for a good harvest. Honey attacked Edward as he was trying to put on Sister Beach's ritual costume. They got into a fight, and in the end Edward was able to neutralize his opponent and went to the celebration. Women in ritual costumes walked across the field. Edward, disguised as a bear, saw Willow, who despite his prohibition, left the house. According to her, there was no other way. It was time for the most secret part of the celebration. Edward was horrified to see Rowan tied. He immediately rushed to help his daughter and set her free. At Sister Summersile's command, the women ran after the man. Meanwhile, he hid behind a tree with Rowan. Suddenly his phone rang. It was Pete. Because the connection was very bad, Edward couldn't tell his colleague what had happened. To Edward's surprise, Rowan ran back to the women. Hugging her mother, the girl asked if she had done everything right. Edward aimed his gun at Sister Summersile, who said him that he had willingly come to meet with the Wicker Man. The hunter became a victim. It turned out that the women had intentionally made up this story about Rowan's disappearance to lure Edward to the island. Willow was also involved. He received that letter from the entire community. The women grabbed Edward and brought him against his will to the huge effigy of the Wicker Man. Now he awaits the fate of a martyr. Edward was placed inside the Wicker Man. Rowan took a torch and set fire to the wooden effigy. The women began to rejoice, repeating that the drone must be sacrificed. Edward's screams echoed throughout the island. Dr. Moss took a photograph. Next events take us 6 months into the future. Two guys who were at a bar noticed two attractive girls. They were Willow and Honey. One of the guy turned out to be a policeman.